Alright, what's going on, guys? I am going to make this short video to try to help everybody out so we can have a better class on Friday and move forward with what we need to learn. I'm going to cover a couple basics that I feel weren't addressed properly that you really need to know in order to understand what's written on this board and move forward with subnetting. So the first thing that wasn't really covered was block size. Block size is the number of IP addresses per subnet. So whether there's 8 hosts or IP addresses in that subnet, or 16 or 32, we really need to know what block size is, and it's the number of IP addresses per subnet. Now, basic knowledge, just to cover real quick, that I think everybody knows for the most part. 3 classes of IPs, A, B, and C, and of course more, but we won't use them. A has a subnet mask of 255.0.0.0, which means I wrote in red the network portion versus blue the host portion. Network portion we cannot touch. The host portion, depending on class A, B, or C, is what we will be subnetting. So, for class A, anytime you see an IP address, such as 192.168.10.34, right? I'm only addressing the first octet. Class A's are everything in the first octet that is 1 to 26. So, 10.4.32.255 or 119.23.56.230. Anything between 1 and 126 in the first octet is a class A. Doesn't matter what's going on in all these other octets, they still fall in between these ranges. Class B is between 128 and 191. Class C is any IP address that starts with 192 to 223. Doesn't matter what's happening in all the last 3 octets, only matters what's happening in the first in order to identify which class it's in. There are private addresses for each of those classes, which is what our computers and devices have as IP addresses since we ran out of public addresses. And then we will have for the most part, one public IP address that NAT, Network Address Translation, will translate our private IP address to the router that has the public IP address, which then can go out and talk to the public internet. So Class A private IP addresses, mainly used in bigger corporations or for ISPs, Internet Service Providers, is 10 dot whatever whatever whatever. Class B is 172.16 whatever whatever. Class C is 192.168.0. Or not .0.0, but anything. For the most part, we will always be working with Class C. It is what most companies use, most households. If you look on your computer, if you open up your command line, and if you have a regular PC like the most of us smart people, if you do an ipconfig, you will see that you have a 192.168.something.something. Or these other ones could be there, but this Class C is used the most. If you have a Mac, you can do an IF config and get the same information. So just a little bit of knowledge for Class A. Since we have all of these last 3 octets that we could subnet, there's a total of 16,777,214 possible hosts that we have in a Class A, which is an amazing amount of hosts. And the reason why this isn't used as much is because nobody needs to subnet and have this many hosts in their company. And like Dr. Huffman was saying in class just yesterday, that would be a lot of unused hosts, and we'd have to blacklist all of them and we would have a lot more security to worry about. So instead of doing all of that, we can move on to a Class B or a Class C and have less hosts, less to worry about. Less things we got to watch, the less security we have to worry about. Class B, the first 2 octets are network in red. The last 2 octets, or 16 bits, are the host. And that'll give us a total of 65,534 hosts. Class C, which is what we see the most, it's only the last octet here in blue that we're hosting. The first 3 octets are all network, we can't touch. We only have 254 hosts that we could use. Don't forget, you could add 2 to all of these, so there's going to be 256 addresses here, but 2 are reserved within that. Remember, the broadcast, which I'll explain, and the network address is reserved. So I know Dr. Huffman basically gave you something like this as a cheat sheet. I haven't looked at it again, and so I'm not sure how close mine is to his, but I have basically these 2 blue lines is just the only thing you really need to know, and then you memorize it, and it's very easy once you do a couple of them. So the first line, I have subnet masks, 128, 192, 224, and so on up to 255. These are the numbers that you're going to be adding to the subnet mask up here. That's supposed to be a K. The subnet mask up here, depending on what our CIDR is, depending on how many bits we're going to be borrowing, okay? And these are easy to remember, I just wrote it down for the lesson. This second line is our binary, and also tends to line up with our block size. So we have 2 for 1 right here, and this is just how when we have our binary written out, all the 1s and all the 0s, this is, if you remember how if we had a 1 here and a 0, 0, 0, 0 all the way down right here, it would be a 128 is our number. If we had a 1, 1, and then all zeros, it's 192, right? And that's exactly what I have up here also. Underneath it, I wrote all the CIDRs, starting with 9 through 16, 17 through 24, 25 through 32, and they line up just like this. So I could explain those in more depth if you are still having trouble with that. But I like to write out this little chart. It makes things super easy. I think all of that we already have for the most part. What we have trouble with is, for instance, on our test, Dr. Huffman gives us an IP address with a CIDR. And then he wants to know the basic information. What's the subnet mask? What's the net address? What's the first host, the last host? What's the broadcast address? And so I broke that down right over here. So let's only go from top to bottom. Don't worry about what else is there. This is actually one of the questions on the test, 155.100.62.14/21, CIDR 21. And he wants to know all the information based off of that. So since we have a CIDR 21, if we go over here to our little chart, we know a CIDR 21. We have a block size of 8. And our subnet mask is going to end with a 248. Okay? And we can do that without this because we know it's a CIDR 21. We know each octet has 8. So if we have 8 for the first one, 8 for the second one, we're at 16. And we're borrowing bits here because it's not 8, 16, or 24. It's in between their CIDR. So we have 8, 16 is the second octet, and then we have 21, which is in the middle of the third octet. So we know we have a 255.255, and then whatever 21 is. 21 ends up with a 248. And then .0, that's our subnet mask, because these are networks, and then we borrowed, if we start from 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, we borrowed 5 bits. And if we count 5 over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or Dr. Huffman would draw a line here, you also can do, our subnet mask is going to end in a 248, and our block size, which is the amount of IP addresses per subnet, is 8, right there on top. So we have our subnet mask, 255, 255, 248, 0. That was easy. Now, where we all got lost, start of the first subnet. since we're changing and working with the third octet, just for our reference, we can go ahead and write out our first given IP address, 155.100, until we get to the octet that we're working with. And let's just put 00. So we know that the first subnet, not the one we're working with this given IP address, but the first subnet starts here, 155.100. Here's our first IP address given to us on the test. And then we're working in this third octet. So we'll just write 00. Now, what did I say the block size was? Block size of 8. So 8 IP addresses per subnet, right? So our first subnet, which doesn't really matter to us because we're not working with that subnet, we're trying to find out what subnet this given IP address is 155.100.1, and then we count up 8 to .8. So that's the first subnet. But we want to find out what subnet the 62 is in. So if we count up 8 to 16, or 1 to 8 is the first subnet, 8 to 16 is the second, 16 to 24, 24 to 32, 32 to 40, 40 to 48, 48 to 56, and then we have another subnet between 56 and 64. Does that 62 fall in there? Yes. So we are working with a subnet that goes from 56 to 64 because our 62 falls in there. So our network address that this subnet belongs to that was given to us is in the 155.156.0. That's the network address, or one of the two reserved, that's why it's blocked in red, addresses. So that's the start of the network. Let's find out what the next subnet network starts at. We just add 8 to it. That's the next, or it's not the next reserve, the broadcast is the next reserve. This red box should be around here also. So if we add our block size of 8, which we got from over here, to the 56, we are at 64. That's the start of the next subnet. So if we back off 1 from the 64, we have the broadcast address of this, which is 155.163.255. If you don't really understand that math, I can kind of go into it in class as well as anybody else, most likely. But since if you take 1 away from 64, it doesn't just make 63, it makes 63.255. I'm sure that's common sense. So now we have our broadcast address and our network address. That's 2 of the questions on the test asked of this IP address. Now that we know where our network starts and where it ends, our address and our broadcast, it's extremely simple. What's the first host? Just one more after the network address. 155.156.1. There's our first host. Guess where our last host is? It's right before the broadcast address. So 155.163, and we have a 255 for the broadcast, so 254. There's our last host. And that's exactly how you break it down and answer all of the questions that are on that test. Just to do a really fast, let me make sure it's lined up for you. This is just a whiteboard on my couch, by the way. This is the next question on the test. Let's do it real quick. I didn't write it out, so I'll have to do it by hand. We have a 180, 22, 230, 217, CIDR 25. Well, we know the third octet goes up to a CIDR 24, so we're borrowing one host bit, which would be a CIDR 25, or if you look over here how I wrote it, so there's a CIDR 25 right there. It lines up with 128 and 128. So our subnet mask is going to be 180 dot, or sorry, I'm a liar, 255 dot 255 dot 255 dot 128. That represents the 1 bit that we borrowed in the last octet, 128. My handwriting's horrible, sorry. Now, let's go ahead and let's find out what our network address is for this. We are borrowing 1 bit, or we can put the line there. I got this little stupid magnet that I'll put there. Let's delete the last line. We're at a CIDR 25, or if you just know we're borrowing 1 bit, so we're here. Our block sizes are 128. See that? Here's our block sizes, 128. That's how many IP addresses per subnet. So, let's go ahead and write this. We know we're working in the last, I'm not even going to do all the other stuff. We know that we're working in the last octet. So let's imagine 180, 122, 230.0. That's where our subnetting would start. So if we're using a block size of 128, we would start at 180.22.230.0, and it would go to 128. Well, we're looking for a 217. That doesn't fall within there, right? So the next subnet would be 128 to 256. Does 217 fit in that? It does. So we know that our network address, that subnet, that's what the network address means, the start or the title of the subnet that we are working in is 180.22.230.128. Okay? Let me just double check here. Yep. And then let's go down and let's get, we're doing boundaries here. That's the start. So let's find out the end. What's 128 plus all the IPs that would be in there plus 128? Because that's the block size. So we're looking at a 256 for the next subnet. That's where the next subnet starts, right? Which we actually can't do, but that's 180.22.230.256. So if we back off 1 from the next subnet, we have our broadcast. 180.22.230.255. Well, now that we have our start of our subnet and our end of our subnet, when they say there's 2 reserved, that's what they mean, this one and this one. What are our usable hosts? The first one and the last one. The first one is right after the network address starts. 180.22.230.129. Okay? The last is simply 1 before the broadcast. 180.22.230.254. And that is how you take an IP address with a CIDR, or even if he gave you the subnet mask, you know what CIDR that is, and answer all of the questions that are there on that test.